Good afternoon, everybody. It's Tuesday, and you know what that means. Close of business Tuesday. Here we go. We're really excited today because as one of the issues that, of course, has been on everyone's mind is what's going on with Washington and what's going on with permitting and the Department of the Interior and all the various, pieces of the Washington bureaucracy and how it's going to affect oil and gas. So we got super, super lucky because we got Kathleen Sgamma, president of the Western Energy Alliance, and Ryan Flynn, president of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, both to join us and talk about these issues, what they know, what they're seeing, what we should be buckling in for. Kathleen, welcome. Ryan, welcome. We're so excited to have you guys. Well, let's kick off, and to kind of put us in the mood. I know Jake Roberts is a young hotshot in our energy group in the research area. Sorry, Jake, I had to say it, but Jake's done a lot of work on some of the issues around permits and federal acreage, etc. Matt, I'm sure you're going to have something to add in. But Mike, tell us what is going on the screen today. Some pretty good oil prices, I understand.
Yeah, Maynard. Things look great. I mean, the screen is really, really green. You have crude oil basically back towards February of 2020 levels. Right now, you've got Brent up to around 57, and you have TI around 53 and change. So, technically, we've broken out with WTI and Brent. Time spreads look great, which tells you the physical market looks great. And what we saw and heard yesterday in the Brent markets is that the oil majors are really taking a lot of barrels and really tightening physical market up. So, what you really have is what we've been talking about for quite a bit of time. I mean, you got the wind at your back for crude oil because demand is going to be improving. You've got constrained supply, and you got monetary and fiscal stimulus globally. Perfect examples. We saw Exxon talking today. I mean, there was concern a year ago, 2 years ago, that guys like that would be growing Permian substantially. And what we heard today on Exxon's call is like, yeah, we're going to protect the dividend. We will lower CapEx, and we're not going to chase price. I think that's the same message we're hearing from E&Ps across the U.S. You throw in what we're going to talk about a little later on with permit issues, federal permit issues. And I think you're talking about constrained supply in a market where demand is going to be improving, and that means prices are going higher. And E&Ps are responding, and the service sector is responding, energy is responding. So, yeah, we have our wind at our back. It looks great. Hopefully that won't be derailed, but that's what we're dealing with right now.
Well, that's a strange juxtaposition. I know we'll get into that because the what's coming out of Washington in terms of like the industry and how it's perceived and how it's going to be treated, it looks not good. So this is a kind of perverse to kick off the discussion with all this green oil prices up stuff. I'm not fussing at you, Mike, for being positive, but don't you find that kind of odd? Matt, let me ask you the question. What do you make of the yin and the yang of this, a green screen and a red Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Maynard, the key thing here is really got to separate the two. So on the micro side of things, there are definitely concerns around the implications for longer term inventory depth. And I think Jake will go through a little bit of that in the analysis the team's pulled together. However, the biggest concern that I think investors have with the space, broadly speaking, and we've talked quite a bit about this over the last couple of years, has been growth capital. And growth capital ultimately has led to too much supply coming out of shale. And ultimately that has caused prices to crack to the downside. So one thing that has popped up in investor conversations is the limitations that may be put on the industry from Washington, while they may be specifically harmful for, I think, states specifically, and then also the industry on a micro basis. On a macro level, if we get into a situation where U.S. growth is curtailed, the macro environment really could see some upside over the next few years because there's not really short cycle capital globally that can respond with supply. And if we continue to see a healthy march higher in demand, the balances start to look more favorable. So that is kind of going on in the market today. And quite frankly, as we talk to investors, there's still a lot of pressure on the industry to avoid growth capital. And this, I think, is also playing into the broader macro discussion we're going to get into here in a second, that regulation is coming down on the industry that may ultimately limit growth. So again, it may be negative for the micro specific stories, but it may actually be a positive tailwind for the macro broadly speaking.
And Maynard, I'd say one thing, and it's something to live and die by, I guess, is better to be putting barrels into the market rather than pulling barrels out of the market. And that's been the biggest issue overhanging, sort of the back end of the curve is OPEC has 7-8 million barrels of spare capacity. If they're putting barrels into the market, the premium on the back end of the barrel is going to start to have to be getting dialed in here. So that's a good thing.
Jake, what do you think? I know you've pulled together some data, and that'll really help our conversation with Ryan and Kathleen, but why don't you give us some of your assessment/stats?
What's interesting is we really started getting questions around this topic during the presidential primaries. Particularly Senator Warren and Senator Sanders drove the most conversation, and it kind of seemed once Joe Biden was ultimately selected, President Joe Biden was ultimately selected, it kind of died down. I think, on the viewpoint that maybe he was a more moderate candidate than some of his peers. We fielded questions on it throughout 2020 through election season, and it kind of ebbed and flowed, with the presidential polls. And once President Biden was elected, it definitely ramped up again, and it certainly has been super topical as he's released these executive orders. And so for some context, this slide here shows the total federal acreage in the United States. And you can see at the top there, it's about 640 million acres, or roughly 28% of the total land in the United States. And you'll see some of your favorite national parks shaded on this map, and it's predominantly a Western states conversation. And I think our guest will speak to that in a little bit. From an oil producing states issue, we really see it most topical in North Dakota, where 9% of total oil production is on federal lands. Wyoming, where 44%, and then New Mexico, where about 47%. Those are all based off 2019 values. Kind of the elephant in the room is, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, where virtually 100% of production coming out of the Gulf of Mexico is going to be under federal purview. New Mexico having the highest percentage is not the only reason why it gets so much focus. It's really because of the amount of production coming from New Mexico. And this slide here shows the total U.S. production, again, kind of through 2019, and the percentage breakdown of non-federal, federal onshore, and then federal offshore. And then there on my right side is New Mexico, in the kind of 903,000 barrels a day, I think was the number in 2019, where roughly 47% of that is coming off federal lands. And then revenue to the federal government is an important issue here. Total U.S. oil production is producing about $6.5 billion of revenue in 2019. Out of New Mexico, it's almost $1.2 billion. And I think our guests will probably be able to expand on the money the states are receiving as well from that. And, again, from an equity perspective, New Mexico certainly gets the most attention because of how crowded it is. And here, this is the maybe 10 operators that I pulled acreage maps for, and then overlaid the blue of the federal land. And by far, this is where we see the most operators overlapped by federal acreage. And it's also one of the most productive areas in the Permian Basin. So it certainly gets a lot of attention from an equity perspective. If you look back over time from 2007 to now, roughly 45% of all horizontal wells have been drilled on federal acreage. And what's interesting is that percentage doesn't change much. Over the last few years, federal wells are usually in the mid to low 40% of total wells drilled in any given year. And so, this comes up quite a bit in our conversations when people ask, will operators suffer if they have to move off federal acreage? Are they better off pursuing federal acreage? Those types of questions. And what we've seen is not really. This is a cumulative production plot from 2018, 2019, and 2020 of well production on federal versus non-federal land, the dotted line being non-federal, the solid line being federal. And while you certainly see some outperformance, if you measure it, it's in the roughly mid to high single digits, and it really only hits that high single digit outperformance much in the out years, and that's really for the 2018 vintage. We don't see that pattern as much in 2019, and 2020 are tracking closely, but again, it's very early to tell in the amount of data we have. And so to Matt's point, The other question that comes up is inventory life, and if a federal ban would really hamper guys that haven't drilled their inventory or, are sitting on a lot of it. And so what this map shows is what we do is we take bore sticks and then we plot those on a map and we count how many bores are in a certain area, those tiny little dots. And so here, this is non-federal land, and you can see, the core of the Northern Delaware Basin, that kind of border between Eddy and Lee counties. On the non-federal side, it's certainly been very busy. And I want to be clear that this is more of a look at activity, because this includes drilled wells, in-progress wells, and permitted wells. And it's not so much a comment on inventory, which is, would need a deeper analysis. But if you compare this, the non-federal kind of well amount to a federal well amount, you see that the most popular areas certainly lie on federal land, and they've definitely been busy. And so I think, the key takeaway here is that near term, what we've heard from operators is they've got plenty of permits to cover for the next 2 to 4 years, probably close, more on the 4-year side of those things. And so the issue becomes, will the federal government allow for those permits to be extended? Onshore permits last for about 2 years before they expire and need to be pushed further. And then, of course, will you be able to get permits beyond what you have now? So for us, I think in the near term, we don't see a lot of risk to production coming off federal lands. In the medium term, it's going to depend on that permit extension discussion. And then longer term, it's going to depend on, future presidents, perhaps, laws signed over the next 4 years that might take these off the table permanently. So it's really, we're going to have to wait and see over the next few years, few months, few years, who knows, to really get a better idea of the longer term impacts to this acreage. And, I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that, Jake. Let me ask Matt and Mike a quick question. The delta between stocks that are exposed to federal acreage versus those who are not, how would you characterize the difference in valuation? How is it showing up in stock price?
Yeah, Maynard. What we really saw was a pretty negative reaction with the moratorium that was announced over the next 60 days from the Biden administration. And the stocks that are exposed to this really got hit pretty hard. So as Jake mentioned, really the key risk here is not the productivity in the near term or the reduction in capital efficiency, but the real risk is that the inventory profile behind the industry, once you step out beyond the existing permits, starts to really wither. And that becomes a bigger problem for these companies because at some point they'll either need to shift capital to less productive areas, or ultimately they're going to have to let this production decline. So, for us, it's not a major concern, I think, for investors over the next 2 to 3 years. But what we're seeing is NAVs for the space in general, so net asset value for the space in general, is coming down because investors are assuming that once we get beyond the 4 years or so of permits that are in hand, essentially the remaining inventory starts to become worthless. And that becomes a bigger problem because at the end of the day, as you look at a lot of these operators that have exposure here, if you have to cut off that inventory profile in this highly prolific area within the federal acreage position, especially New Mexico, most only have about 5 years left of inventory without existing permits continuing to get extended. And so that's the bigger problem for the stocks in general. And I think that's why we saw a lot of these equities sell off, between 10 and 20% over the last few weeks as this announcement came out.
Colin, as we turn to Ryan and Kathleen to dig into the meat of all this, I just have one question. We need this oil and gas. Like the last time I checked, we actually need this. So we've chosen to penalize oil that comes from our country that is produced in the cleanest way possible, that employs Americans doing it and pays the American government tax revenues. This is in stark contrast to oil from other places. So help me, what are we doing here? You're our big brain. Can you possibly come up with a policy rationale for this?
Well, there's a lot in there. I would say that one of the core problems, before you get to facts and opinions about what to do with it, is we are at a moment in time, and the moment in time has a certain utilization rate. And the demand of today is not what the demand of a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now will be. And the lesson of commodity markets for time immemorial is that if you only pay attention to the instantaneous present, instead of anticipating what the futures market is trying to teach you, you will suddenly find that it all happens a lot faster than you would have thought possible, because the utilization rate quickly goes from 70 to 75, 80, 85, and then suddenly you don't have it, and somebody goes to turn the lights on and the lights don't go on. That's what happened in California last year. It was well-intentioned to retire a lot of gas-fired power, but if you do not anticipate that it can get hot in California in the middle of summer and tens of millions of people all turn on the air conditioning at the exact same time, you will get a $1,000 per megawatt hour price to resolve the collective demand of the group. And that is the risk we're going to run here. And, you know, I saw today an article that was talking about, well, we're creating so many new clean energy jobs and all these pipeline workers will be fine. Well, I don't see that job being offered today. And these people have just lost their job and they have to feed their families and they have bills. And it's cold comfort to say, well, maybe 5 years from now, there'll be a clean energy job for you. The promise was that if jobs go away, there will be some sort of safety net to carry them. And I think we all know that has not happened. And that is a problem no matter where you sit on whether we should have production from any given jurisdiction.
These moves, how much did they help the climate? I'm using
you usually
as
say I'm
like,
leading the witness when you ask a question like that. So I will.
I'm curious. We're all for helping the climate. How much did we help the climate? I'm wondering.
Well, obviously not at all in the near term. And I'll point out that today in the European emissions market, looking at that futures market, we are now crossing 35 euros for the first time in many of those forward markets, implying that there will be carbon to trade, which means that production will be out there. And if it's not coming from Wyoming or New Mexico, then we are talking about production from Libya, Nigeria, Iraq. To further your point, it's proved in that forward curve that we anticipate that these emissions will be there. We anticipate the demand for the product will be there. And I am looking at live prices, bid ask right now for these emissions forward in time.
Thank you, Colin. And yes, I did lead the witness. Thanks for being a good witness. I'm just curious. Kathleen, let's jump in with you because Jake said, when you had your map up there, Jake, this is absolutely a Western focus item. I mean, so much of the federal acreage in the United States is in the West. You're with the Western Energy Alliance. Tell us what's going on in your world. Your phone must be ringing off the hook. A lot of people very upset, very concerned. What would you tell us? And thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Maynard. So we did not take that announcement lying down. In fact, we sued within minutes because of some of the reasons touched on here already. This is a ban on leasing only, so to speak. But we know how quickly leasing can affect existing projects. Producer needs adjacent acreage, or they're trying to drill a tribal well on tribal lands, but it has to cut across a small patch of federal minerals underneath. So that holds up the tribal because you can't get that federal lease. So there's a lot of complexity in the West regarding the interlocking nature of land ownership in the West. So we are challenging the soon-to-be failure to hold quarterly lease sales. That will be the main cause of our litigation. The federal government is required under the Mineral Leasing Act to hold quarterly lease sales in states where there is interest. And there's certainly interest in New Mexico. There's certainly interest in Wyoming, North Dakota. We saw on Friday that the Interior Secretary yanked back 70 permits that had been approved, some in New Mexico, and said, we're revoking these permits. So it's already affecting existing acreage if they're denying permits. And the nature of the ban is such that if you've hit your head on the wall over these federal public lands issues as long as I have, you know that when they say they're going to take a pause in leasing to study the impacts, what that means is a programmatic environmental impact statement. There hasn't been an oil and gas EIS or environmental impact statement done in the West that takes fewer than 5 years. Some of them take as much as 10. This temporary pause is really a longer term leasing ban. And they're also looking at the impacts of permitting and transport. They're going to look at all of the climate change impacts from oil and natural gas development to come up with a way to say this just should not happen. So that's why we were fairly aggressive right off the bat. A temporary becomes a permanent, and even a temporary one is not within the power of the presidency.
And Kathleen, just a little about your organization. I know it's a consortium of states, but could you just give us some more details about your people, your budget, your history, just so we all learn a little bit more?
So we represent oil and natural gas producers across the Rocky Mountain West. Utah, Colorado, North Dakota, New Mexico, Wyoming, et cetera.
So the companies are the members. The companies themselves
That's right.
are members.
That's right. We're a trade association. So we have about 200 member companies that operate on federal lands or non-federal lands throughout the West. So we focus on federal issues, public lands being a big one, tribal issues, air quality, those types of issues that affect the business climate in the West.
And Ryan, maybe I could come to you. You're the president of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. Welcome and thank you for joining. I know New Mexico is one of the key states that we always talk about when this issue comes up. Kathleen mentioned something that I have heard too, which is, yes, this is a federal lease discussion, but it's also the interlocking between federal and state acreage and rights of way and all sorts of little fine details can make this impact much larger than just, quote, the federal lease. But let me turn it to you. You can build on that or anything else you might share with us. We know you've been fighting this battle every day, just like Kathleen.
Well, obviously, I think the presentation before me really helped emphasize why this issue is so important in the West. And certainly in New Mexico, we're the largest source of onshore federal production in the United States. And I actually have the 2020 numbers regarding revenue from the industry. And we got about 1.5 billion in federal royalty revenue for 2020. So and we actually just put out a release talking about that a couple minutes ago. So New Mexico gets about 54% of the oil and gas revenue from its federal share. So there's a huge impact for our state. The politics are interesting because we have a Democratic governor. Of the states that have been mentioned, we're not only a large federal onshore producer, but then we have Governor Lujan Grisham, who is part of President Biden's transition team. So it's, we're very much on the front lines, and there's a lot of interest here. Just to kind of point on, I think to piggyback on Kathleen's point, she hit the nail right on the head. And she's been, has really unparalleled experience dealing with federal issues over the last, decade or longer. Certainly the idea that this is a moratorium or a pause or whatever you want to call it on new leases, it creates bad precedent from a policy perspective. But I want to point out that there's a huge impact on existing operations that's occurring today. And that is quite frankly the most significant issue we're dealing with right now, is that existing operations are being impacted. And this is a point that the White House, we had a little over a week and a half ago, the Department of Interior came out with their temporary suspension of delegated authority. That was their order. And they were saying, hey, we're going through a transition. All we're doing is stripping all of the career staff and the field offices from their ability to make decisions. And it's going to be made by a limited number of political appointees in DC during this 60-day transition. And on the face, everyone understands new president, new administration, you need time to transition. But the impact of that has been to just basically freeze all activity and all decision making at the field office. So not only is Kathleen correct in terms of last week, we had a number of producers who had been issued permits, had those clawed back, but we also have a lot of producers who have valid permits who've drilled the well, and they were just waiting to get a right of way approved so they could connect the well to a pipeline. And so, the options now are to start to truck that oil around and to flare or vent the gas. So, and you saw then after that temporary suspension, you saw the executive order come out on climate change. It talked about, like Kathleen said, kind of programmatic review, pausing new leases, and that while we look at programs and permitting and formulate policy. And the talking points associated with that executive order really argued vehemently that this is only prospective, it's not impacting existing operations. And again, this of course is the issue we're experiencing right now in New Mexico, is existing operations are absolutely being impacted. And so operators are not getting routine authorizations. The only sundries, which are really common bread and butter administrative approval that occurs that on the field office, literally dozens of those would occur within each week at least. Those are not being approved. Rights of way, as I mentioned, those are not being approved. New permits obviously are not being approved. I mean, we've really seen activity just freeze at the field level. And so, there's this kind of disconnect between talking points saying, hey, we're just trying to suspend future leases. And oh, by the way, you've heard the talking points about, hey, there's all these permits that were issued under the last couple months of the Trump administration. But again, just because you have a permit, that doesn't stop your interaction with the regulatory agencies. You might have to move the well, 20, 30 feet. When you complete the well, you're going to need to connect. So that there's still, it's not like you got the permit, you're done interacting with the Bureau of Land Management. There's a lot of routine existing operations that are currently being impacted. So this is a big deal. I feel more comfortable about our ability to deal with some of the longer term ramifications and work through it than I do about the current impacts we're seeing today, because you're not going to get time back. And I do think, this idea that, hey, there's nothing going on today is just simply wrong. It's not correct.
Ryan, on that point, we're about to head into earnings season. I think we're going to hear a lot of the E&P management teams on the public side talk about this in a lot of detail. The messaging we're hearing from them so far is generally that on the existing operations, they're either looking to potentially accelerate some of the permit development or will shift activity towards some of the non-federal acreage and look towards development on the state side. But it sounds like, based on what you're seeing with boots on the ground, that there's a much bigger impact occurring at the moment. And I was just curious if you're seeing that from large public E&Ps all the way down to the smaller private operators. Is this something that's universally impacting the industry? Because there seems to be a little bit of a different narrative between what I think we're going to hear from the public operators and maybe what you're seeing in real time.
So I think the larger companies have more options with respect to shifting capital, and they've been preparing. Like you had mentioned or was mentioned earlier. We've been seeing federal land management policy played an unusual role during the presidential campaign. So people have been the ball kept moving, and even with President Biden, his positions evolved over even from when he was. Hadn't secured the Democratic nomination to then even when he was the nominee, where it was, discussion of prohibiting fracking, prohibiting leasing, prohibiting permitting. There was a lot of movement in terms of where the policy was going to fall. And so a lot of the larger companies, they've been hedging and preparing for this, I think, for months. So I do think, the larger producers are situated to be able to navigate either through state or private land in New Mexico or through their positions in other states. So I think the smaller producers who just simply don't have the same types of portfolios have less optionality in terms of shifting personnel, shifting drilling programs, things like that. So I do think that some of the smaller and we're not talking like the large domestic independents or the large the super majors. I think kind of like the smaller operators who, maybe only drilling, half a dozen wells a year or less. And those are the ones who are locked in and have, a lot more pressure on them than some of the larger companies who again, they're being impacted, but it's, they have options and they're shifting capital to adjust. And I mean, that's what I'm seeing at the larger level is they've been prepared. They have more flexibility. Some of the smaller players who are trying to be a little bit more aggressive, and you get a better royalty on federal acreage. So, developing federal acreage, it's been historically a little bit, a lot more of a headache than doing business on state land. But the reward is you get a better royalty rate. So, some of the smaller producers might have seen value by developing some of that federal acreage, and they don't have the same types of options or flexibility that some of the bigger players do.
Kathleen, let me pull you back in on, I know you mentioned you filed a lawsuit, and you mentioned the quarterly lease sale will probably be the, sort of the angle, if you will. But what are the other ways to stop this, or what else was flawed in this? The fact that, it's an executive order. I don't know my constitutional law well enough, but how else could this be stopped or overturned?
Well, that's why I want to emphasize it's not all doom and gloom. Certainly we have, hard to say energetic, but we have, certainly it is energetic. I mean, a new administration wants to come in. They want to make a splash. We've seen all these executive orders, but just like some of the Trump executive orders, a lot of these Biden executive orders are very vulnerable. So that's why we're in court. We reserve the right to expand our causes of action as we see permits being denied or permits missing their timelines. So we've got hooks under the Energy Policy Act of 2005 with those permitting deadlines. We have the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, which states that while environmental analysis is being done, you can just hold up all activities on federal lands and stop making decisions. So that when we start to see them saying, oh, we can't really do permits because we're getting close on this environmental analysis. And so we can, fire those FLPMA arguments as well. So I really think that this was an overreach, and it's very vulnerable in court. And that's why we feel very optimistic. Certainly those micro impacts that Matt talked about and Ryan's talking about the impacts today, I'm not minimizing those at all. And in fact, just from a leasing ban, a University of Wyoming professor found that in the first year alone, 32,600 jobs would be lost. And by the end of the Biden term, that number grows to 58,000, but $33.5 billion in GDP is lost just by a leasing ban, even if it's fairly constrained just to new leases, for all of these spillover effects we've been talking about. And so, that overreach is the key to overturning. So we like our options in court. Congress continues to be even more divided than it was before. It's even closer margins. We have moderates in Congress that we can deal with. We have, as Ryan mentioned, the governor of New Mexico. That is an interesting wild card in all of this and how she can influence this administration. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. Like I said, overstepping gives you the seeds for overturning.
Well, I like what you said, Kathleen. You pulled me back from the cliff there. I was getting a little doom and gloom. So you've geared me up a little
I've got a question, Ryan.
Ryan, can I just ask one question? I guess Kathleen mentioned the governor of New Mexico. There are other New Mexico people who are influential in the administration. I guess I'm just a dunce. I don't understand, if you're from New Mexico, how you can't be pro-responsible oil and gas. It pays, as a percent of your budget, you would know the number better than me, but what happens to the people of New Mexico in the absence of oil and gas would be devastating.
Yeah, no, it's
okay. Maybe I'm being too simple here.
No, I think you're right. Not to be all doom and gloom either. There's certainly, like I said, there's quite a bit of disruption that's occurring today. And I actually think the temporary order from the Department of Interior is much more harmful than the EO that came out last week from President Biden. But from a budgetary perspective, last year, oil and direct revenue, we're not talking about indirect revenue, just purely direct revenue to the state was 33.5% of our budget came directly from oil and gas revenue. It was about $2.8 billion last year. The year before, it was almost 40% of the state's budget. Over the last 10 years, it's usually right about where it is last year. It's usually a little over a third each year comes directly from oil and gas revenue. We don't have a diversified economy. I mean, certainly the oil and gas industry would love to see others bear their share of the tax burden in New Mexico, but we don't. I mean, we're as a state, we are very dependent on revenue from oil and gas and then revenue from federal facilities. We have 3 Air Force bases, 2 national laboratories, a permanent waste repository for high-level waste in Carlsbad at the WIT facility. So New Mexico doesn't have a diversified economy. We are very dependent on oil and gas revenue. I think that makes this more complicated for our state than perhaps any other state. Even someplace like Colorado, where oil and gas is significant, it's not as significant as it is in New Mexico. I think so. I think that's one point that's important, is that we're the front lines of this transition, and you'll see consequences associated with these types of policy decisions right here, impacting a state where over a fifth of the state is already living below the federal poverty line. So there are major ramifications that we'll witness right here. I do think, stepping back and thinking more kind of big picture, what we've seen in New Mexico can be instructive in terms of, Governor Lujan Grisham ran on a campaign 2 years ago of taking ambitious and aggressive action to combat climate change. And, she was very aggressive as a candidate. As a governor, she's also been very aggressive in pursuing an ambitious climate change agenda, but she's done it without harming the oil and gas industry. So I feel like there is a positive example right here in New Mexico, where you have a governor who understands some of the bigger picture perspective, not only about the revenue to the state, but also that as long as there's going to be demand for our products, it's going to be produced somewhere. So why don't we raise the bar and incentivize domestic production in the United States and make sure our production is the most responsible production in the world, and really set the bar high so that we can be leaders on these issues. And that's her approach. So, we've got a governor who's a very, I wouldn't say a moderate Democrat. She's a very firm Democrat who's been aggressive on climate change, but has been finding win-wins with the industry and pursuing these policy proposals. So that, to me, gives me some optimism that we absolutely, if we're given a chance to work through these issues, as an industry, we can do it. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we can find ways to work through some of, aggressive or ambitious proposals. We've proven we can do it. We're willing and able to do it. It's just, we got to be given a seat at the table to have these conversations. And that was why I found the 60-day order in particular to be troubling, because it was just very ham-handed and overly aggressive, and it does impact existing operations, and we don't get that time back.
Well, that was a great point. Jake, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Hey,
yeah.
Maybe this is for Kathleen. I think you've mentioned the EIS type approach, and I think if we think about the pipelines that have been in the news, that's certainly more of a kind of environmental question. You can see how the timeline it takes to settle those and ultimately get a perhaps negative outcome. And looking to oil production in the western states, how much, I guess, do you see the return of the dune lizard EPA approach, the sage grouse in Wyoming type approach? Are there a lot more quivers that this administration could use beyond executive orders on leases and the EIS? I mean, I feel like one of the things we get hit on a lot is, or questioned a lot on, is the EPA has a lot of power here, whether that's methane emissions or flaring or whatnot, those types of things. And I'm just curious, is there going to be one battle after the other?
Yes, they already have that ability to do death by 1,000 cuts. They have many regulatory levers at their disposal. They don't need to do some type of grandiose leasing ban or permitting ban to really gum up operations on federal lands. However, again, your trade associations know how to deal with that. And that's where I make my plug that, investors need to think of participating in trade associations because they can help reduce that risk, as we are on federal lands, as Ryan is working with the state on methane regulations to make sure those regulations are workable. We do the same on all kinds of regulatory issues. So I really see another cycle of the Obama administration. Perhaps the rhetoric is more vitriolic than it was during the start of the Obama administration, but we're going to go through another cycle. We survived it with the Obama administration. And in fact, we became the #1 producer in the world despite all of that regulatory pushback. So yes, we'll see sage grouse and, all kinds of species, and we'll see more regulation. But again, we know how to participate in those regulatory processes. We do have a seat at the table under the Administrative Procedures Act. When it comes to NEPA, that environmental analysis, we also have a seat at the table. We will participate constructively in all of that NEPA and all of those ESA listings, those endangered species listings. So we got to participate in that. And then we do have the lever of suing when we need to. So Western Energy Alliance was very involved in sage grouse plans, developing that and then litigating on them. And that's been on again, off again, but that's always a tool in our toolkit as well.
One question, Kathleen. I know we also saw the Keystone decision, and you hear a lot about labor unions being friends. I guess the industry doesn't have a ton of unionized labor, but what would you say about other friends like that who are trying to make the case about some of these issues broadly, other allies, manufacturing, et cetera?
We take the alliance part of Western Energy Alliance very seriously. So we're always building alliances. I think you're going to see some of these energy attorneys general act pretty soon. I think they're geared up. So that's a key ally. The governors of Wyoming and North Dakota are very energized because Wyoming's in a similar situation to New Mexico. Huge part of its budget and its economy is based on oil and gas, of course. So, and then of course you've got chambers and, manufacturers that understand how many jobs the industry has created by affordable natural gas and electricity. We brought back industries from Germany because of the high energy prices created by Germany's climate change policies. So there are lots of alliances. Like I said, we know how to do the regulatory process. We know how to build alliances with Congress and policymakers all across the region and in DC. So we know how to manage the risk that we're seeing from these policies. It creates some pain and it creates a lot of work for us. But then again, that's job security too, until they put us all out of business, right?
Well, you seem like you've referenced it. You've seen administrations change, and you kind of know that there's some patterns here that we always see, and we kind of have to be calm a little bit about it. Matt, I think
right.
You have
Calm and have a large legal defense fund like Western Energy.
There you go. Calm and hire an attorney. Okay. Matt, what do you think?
Kathleen, just a follow-up question to that. I think the Wyoming's kind of an interesting discussion. We talk a lot about the reservoir and the rock and how much inventory we have, but there's also a lot of lead time that goes into infrastructure, especially around gas plants and in basins that are emerging like the Powder. Those lead times could be multiple years. And then I think the investment behind that also is pretty significant because these are typically assets you want to use for the next decade or so. How do you think the industry is thinking about this as we kind of progress through this regulatory risk? And does that pose a risk to infrastructure expansion and capital investment alongside things like we're talking about at the drill bit level?
It's this risk I'm talking about managing that you just put a finer point on. So yeah, there's concern throughout the industry on this. And that's why I do like to talk about it's not all doom and gloom. It's a cycle. It can be worked through. It has to be managed. Resources need to be put into that regulatory process and into legal processes where necessary. And, that's one of the reasons Western Energy Alliance did not wait to sue. It was putting that placeholder in court, certainly, but also messaging to the administration that, we take this seriously, messaging to the investment community that we have ways to push back against these policies. And so it's not that we're just going to take this lying down. The law is on our side. Overreach from the executive branch is to be expected, and it can be managed.
And I'd like to just ask one quick follow-up there, just around the extension process. I think this is probably the biggest concern for investors today, is just the methodical nature of how extensions have been treated. Could you talk a bit about how the industry's thinking about that, potentially some of the legal pushback that the industry might have around that kind of historical process on extensions?
You're talking about permit extensions?
Correct.
I think that's a really interesting point, because extending a permit by 2 years has almost been automatic, even during the Obama administration. If that suddenly became not automatic, then that would really show an infringement on valid existing lease rights. And frankly, that would give us another cause of action in court. I do like, that the wheels are spinning up here as far as thinking, wow, that's really something we've got to be watching for, is also those extensions not being granted. That would be a really aggressive measure for them not to extend those, but I could see them doing it, because you do have some real ideologues in any administration who's going to look at that as like, oh, we can't extend those Trump permits. So that's that is an interesting question that I think we do have to take up that issue.
One question I have, just out of curiosity, you always wonder, like, what is it like to work in the local BLM office? Like, it's just never felt like, it's always felt like a really hard place to work. You got administrations changing. I've never known, the profile of someone who takes that job. I know it's probably, it's hard to be simplistically described, but aren't their heads spinning? Like, how hard is it to work in those places? How do we get people who want to work in those places? Are people going to start quitting? Like, I'm curious. Do you have any color on that?
I think you've got a lot of career BLM employees who know how to ride the political waves, first and foremost, but they do know how to take signals from the top. And so it was very important when Obama came in and that message got quickly down to the field offices that, slow walking permits is going to be rewarded here. Not making decisions right away on oil and gas is going to be rewarded. Same thing during the Trump administration. They got the message from the top that it was an energy dominance agenda. So they did move forward with permits. The political will from the top is very important, but it doesn't completely nullify the obligations that BLM has. As far as speaking to the profile of your local BLM, I think they want to do the right thing. They do get pulled in different directions, but you have some who are, more of the petroleum engineers that have been working at BLM that understand the multiple use. But you do have the ability for career staff to be employed who have a different, ideological orientation. BLM definitely has a hard job. No matter what they do, they're going to make somebody mad. Anytime they make a decision on whether to open a certain area to leasing or to close it, they're going to get pushback. So it's this balance that nobody's ever 100% happy. We certainly in the industry understand that multiple use balance and how we don't ask for everything we want because we know they have to have that balance. But we are faced with opposition in the environmental community that is driven on an agenda of keep it in the ground, no more oil and gas. They are never satisfied. They're going to sue on everything. And that's why they're suing on every single lease. They sue on any land use plan that includes any oil and natural gas. They are definitely not balanced, but BLM has to be. And in general, they do try to do that balancing act as much as they get screamed at from both sides.
Ryan, you were smiling when I asked that question, like you had like a funny BLM story, or there was just something in your face. You were going to share it.
No, I mean, I managed in a couple of years ago. I spent about 6 years managing the state environmental agency, the New Mexico Environment Department. We had about 650 employees there.
Wow.
I was the Secretary of Environment. So I've gone through political transitions, managed government staff, and so I agree with. I think Kathleen hit the nail on the head. I think most of the employees in these government agencies, they just want to do their jobs, and there is definitely a risk aversion. Anytime there's a political transition, people do get nervous, and they don't want to be out on a ledge. So I think it's going to take some time right now to get staff on the front lines, feeling comfortable that they kind of understand the parameters that they can do their jobs within. But I don't think that they want to show up and twiddle their thumbs and do nothing all day. They work directly with us. They know that the men and women who they're interacting with from the regulated industry are good people who are smart and know what they're talking about. And so, I think it puts them in a little bit of a tight spot because they want to do their job, and they're kind of caught between, industry and these political agendas. And so I think, again, we can navigate transitions, and we'll be able to work through this in the longer term. It's just the short term, while they go through this kind of normalization process, understanding what their boundaries are, where they can issue permits, where the red lines are, that's going to be an adjustment process, and it's going to take some time.
I mean, they feel like the kid's caught in a really bad divorce. Like, you just feel for them, Yeah. So if anyone's watching from the BLM, we love you guys. We appreciate you. We know it's hard. Colin, I got to ask you a question. You'd always throw you the really fastballs here, but if you'd been standing in the Oval Office and all this stuff had been discussed, and if someone had asked the question, is this the best way to advance the green agenda by picking on, would you have recommended this just purely from we want to advance the green agenda? Does this approach make sense to you? I'm again slightly leading the witness. But if you're really all about the environment, is this what you would do, practically speaking?
Well, you usually ask me to give fact-based answers, and there you're asking me to give an opinion, and I will share my opinion. I would not. I agree with the points that Kathleen and Ryan made, which are extremely balanced and reasonable in my view. And if you claim that you care about certain values of environmentalism and protection of labor and smooth markets and fairness and equity and the rule of law and sanctity of contracts, you can't do stuff like this. You are clearly violating some of those principles as well. And if I had a magic wand, what would I do? I would privilege jurisdictions of the world that do protect human rights, rule of law, sanctity of contract, engineers, minority rights. Have a debate. A free society can decide it doesn't want to do something, but to just come in and yell at each other all the time and claim that you have moral superiority is clearly not the answer. And so I would begin asking questions about some of the regimes of the world who do not have these principles and values, and what are they going to do in terms of feeding human civilization's demand for energy in a reasonable, prudent way as the energy competition unfolds. But that's my opinion, and I admit it's an opinion.
Hey, can I give you a fact to help you with that opinion, Colin?
Please.
And that is, I draw your attention to that study that the University of Wyoming professor did on the leasing ban. And he found that this leasing ban costs between $64 and $196 per ton of carbon avoided. And that compares quite inefficiently to the $15 ton per carbon emission that is currently on the California cap and trade system. So,
can I add one point to Colin's answer too? I'll be quick. I agree with everything he said. And one of the things that's been frustrating for me, and now I've gotten maybe a little more cynical at this point, was when you try to look at some of these issues from an environmental perspective, you're inevitably going to be incorrect, because that's not the prism that you need to look at these. These are environmental issues and energy issues are really just becoming political proxies. And it's been frustrating, I think, for someone like me or others who are looking to figure out how do we solve some of these important environmental issues, and why are we incentivizing or driving production away from the most responsible producer, from places that treat workers better than other jurisdictions, who are like our industry in New Mexico is stepping up and agreeing to more stringent regulation and trying to figure out how to do more with less, reduce water consumption. I mean, we are stepping up from an environmental perspective time and time again. And, the thing that gets frustrating is we're looking at it from an environmental perspective. And unfortunately, a lot of these issues are really just political proxies, and they're about, political fights. And unfortunately, I think the rubber meets the road on some of these issues when cost goes up. If demand keeps increasing and you start paying $5 a gallon at the pump, man, we might be having a very different conversation on some of the federal policy pretty quickly. And that, again, it has less to do with the environment, which we're trying to do everything correct from an environmental perspective. And it, unfortunately, a lot of times it has nothing to do with the environment, and it's more about a political proxy. And then, that's inherently an irrational conversation in and of itself.
You guys you're all right. We need to stop doing all that. I think Keystone, we could have announced, hey, we've got a solution. It's going to be, and they had one, right? Like it was going to be powered by renewables. Like it was the ultimate, like no more trucks, pipeline, jobs, Canadian Aboriginal tribes own equity in it. I mean, like we keep missing these opportunities, like you were saying about Governor Grisham, to find really balanced approaches. But, well, as we wrap up, Kathleen and Ryan, I think all of us would just like to say thank you, not just for coming on the show, but for what you're doing every day. What could we do to help you? What would, we would love to help you do what you're trying to do, which is, just for the common good. But
I appreciate the question, and just having exposure in this kind of forum is very helpful. I think investors and companies need to understand that trade associations are helping them reduce this risk, and we need the resources to do so.
Well, we'll attach a link to the Western Energy Alliance and to NMOGA in our blast tomorrow. But Ryan, how about you? What can we do?
Honestly, I think we need to keep having conversations grounded in facts and really talking about policies in ways that are rational and grounded in how can we do our, move forward from an environmental perspective. American energy producers, the companies I represent, the companies Kathleen represents, we do a better job than anyone else in the world. And, honestly, President Trump, it was incredibly frustrating because we weren't having smart policy. We should have been looking at policy discussions about opening export markets for our production in the United States. We produce it more reliably and responsibly than anywhere else in the world. So to me, we got to we need to really support domestic producers in the United States. As long as there's demand for these products, it should be produced here. If you care about climate change, then you should be supporting production in the United States rather than driving production away from the US. Or, I think we keep missing the mark on some of these issues, and our producers don't do a good enough job or get enough credit for how innovative they've been from an environmental perspective. The industry today is vastly different than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. But, we are the sustainability is part and parcel of every conversation with senior executives at these companies. And I guarantee that's not the way the boardrooms or the executive suites are confronting these issues in other jurisdictions around the world.
Well, you said that so well. Closing kind of tidbit for the day that I was struck by. I listened to the Exxon earnings call today, and they had a slide in there, which was, and they made a point that of all the CO2 that's been captured since 1970, they've captured 40% of it, which is, so our industry, people don't realize the technology, the capability, the innovation, and we've just got to get focused on the goal and stop, to your point, politicizing everything. Well, this was wonderful. Kathleen, thank you. Ryan, thank you.
Thank you.
Colin, Matt, Jake, great work. You proved me right. You are a hotshot and you know it. Mike, thanks as always. And thanks to everybody out there.